Servlets Part 2, Database Connected Servlets. What I want to do now is go through a couple of kind of real-world examples with you of how you can use servlets, Tomcat, and HTML pages to make a pretty cool tool that allows you to generate a web page and then use a servlet as the middle tier between you and your database and generate some dynamic HTML. Let's take a look at the schema of the application first before we jump right into the code. As I've mentioned earlier, servlets are great for that middle tier. As a matter of fact, it's really sometimes the only viable option that you have. You see, you have a database over here. This contains maybe some kind of corporate data. And maybe it's an e-commerce, it could be any kind of database. Maybe it's doing online transaction, OLTP, maybe for an e-commerce site or just basically a search engine. And let's just say this is some kind of relational database management system. For our example, I'm going to be using Microsoft, and it's important that I stress Microsoft because I want you to see how I can combine various technologies together. Microsoft SQL 2000 Server. So let's see what we're going to be using here. Over here, I've got a client. And for all intents and purposes, this person could be using any kind of web browser. Really, the HTML that I've done this with is so basic and so straightforward that any web browser will go ahead and be able to process it. I'll just put the big two, NN, Netscape Navigator, or IE, Internet Explorer. So we're going to use, in our example, we'll use MS Internet Explorer. And that's because I'm using Windows XP. Alright, so what's going on over here? Well, here is the servlet / web server. Okay, so this is our servlet server. It's also our, let me make that a little better. It's also our web server. Okay. Now, what we're using for both is Apache Tomcat. That is what we're using for both here. So let's see the process. What is going to be going on here? One thing I want to explain or kind of reiterate to you is that, remember, when a web client makes a request to the web server, the HTTP request is made. The web server receives the request. Let's say it's in the format of an HTML page here. Okay. Web server receives the request. Then it streams back HTML to the client, and then HTML is processed and rendered on the client here. So because the processing and rendering is happening on the client here, once that server responds, okay, remember, request, response, okay, yes, that does correlate to our HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. Once the server responds, you're cut off. So, and you're all processing on your client. So how in the world are you supposed to kind of come and talk to this guy? Well, the answer is that you cannot do it. So you need to use a servlet. So that's the problem. So how does a servlet solve this? Well, let's take a look. What a servlet's going to do is it's going to also, okay, we're going to make a request, okay, but now, because let's say we're using a form whose action is the servlet does some processing here first. In this particular example, it's going to hit the SQL server, get the result, and it's going to connect with JDBC for us, okay? It's going to return some data for us. Then we generate the results as HTML back to the client, okay? So notice how what we do before when we're dealing with a servlet, and this will be true of a JSP page too, any kind of server-side technology. Something happens on the server first. The processing has happened before it's sent. If you just ask or make a request of a .html page, a web server is essentially just a glorified internet file server at that point.